and let me welcome everybody to the Big Rethink Interviews. We have Kathleen Fitzpatrick, and can you just quickly tell us your current title again?
Sure. I'm Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University.
Which is fantastic. And so we have a set of questions for you, and these are questions that we've, what do they say in the social sciences, administered to a wide range of people. In the humanities, we'll say we ask the questions. And these are generated by a mix of people, including the Big Rethink's faculty, staff, and especially students. And they start off at a kind of large level, then they get larger still, and then they zoom in a bit. As we go, I think so far, some of the interviews have seen echoes back and forth where interviewees will anticipate questions, and I'll take care of that and address that. And some of the questions may bounce off of your same answer in a few ways, but let's proceed. The first question to ask is, this is a kind of big picture question. Yeah. What are you seeing in the higher education landscape as it responds to both COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter mobilization?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, part of what I'm seeing stems from the work that I had done in my recent book, which came out last year, called Generous Thinking: A Radical Approach to Saving the University. And, you know, a big part of what I'm arguing in that book is that the university as we understand it today, and for the most part, I'm referring to public institutions of higher education that are intended to serve a broad swath of the public, that those institutions have in some sense lost the confidence of the public that they serve, right? And some of it has to do with, over the last couple of decades, extraordinarily rising costs of higher education for what seem like decreasing benefits. But, you know, the part of that sort of divide and that loss of confidence in higher education has come, I think, from institutions of higher education becoming decreasingly able to tell their story in convincing ways to the public, to get the public on their side, to say this is the mission that higher education is really meant to serve, not credentialing in any kind of purely economic sense, not a purely individualistic sense of gain, but instead a real social good that comes from having a broadly educated public. Because institutions haven't been able to tell that story, because they haven't been convincing about where they find their mission and their values to lie, people have fallen away from really believing in what higher education can do for them and for their communities. And, you know, one of the things that has become clear in the last 6 months is that that loss of trust has dangerously corrosive effects on the commitment of students and parents and communities to higher education, and even worse, massively eroded the public sense of higher education as a good that needs to be funded on behalf of the society. And as a result, now we're seeing institutions that are more worried about what's going to happen to the bottom line if students don't come back to school in the fall than they are worried about what's going to happen to the community on their campuses and surrounding their campuses if students do come back to campus in the fall. And so we're like the values have gotten all out of whack. And we're now facing this crisis in which institutions really have to find ways to reorient themselves to those values, or they run the risk of doing enormous harm to the people that make up those institutions, to their lives, to their families, to their communities. It's a real bind, and it's not being resolved with the kinds of resounding commitment that one would hope to see at this point.
So, and this, everything you describe was true in January 2020, before COVID really thwacked the US and before the killing of George Floyd.
Absolutely.
The,
Absolutely. It's just those events have highlighted the gaps and the fractures that have been there in higher education for a long time.
actually anticipates another question, which is really good, and we'll come to that. But thank you.
Sure.
That's a very, very rich answer. Now, that's a very qualitative answer. That's a very humanities answer, which makes sense from one English professor to another. Totally makes sense. But our next question asks you to switch gears a little bit and think about quantitative measures. When you're thinking about these transformations in higher education, and you have such a great perspective with your multi-institutional background and your association background and your scholarship about higher education, what trends, in fact, what metrics do you track in trying to follow this? And which trends or metrics should we track?
It's another interesting question that I'm going to dance around a little bit. I am not a qualitative thinker. I am just not. I am a longtime humanist. I come out of an English department. I live, and breathe English departments by and large. And so I don't tend to track metrics in the ways that, a good social science oriented researcher of higher education ought to, right? It's the kind of thing I ought to do, and I just don't, because for some reason my brain doesn't work that way. What I tend to find myself following instead of metrics per se is more waves. Noticing that something is in the air and that it's happening a lot, and that, I'm hearing recurrent phrases and concerns, or I'm seeing announcements that are happening in patterns. What's happening this week, interestingly, is institutions slowly beginning to accelerate in their announcements that they have decided to go all digital after all for the fall, or at least to begin that way. And that's a definite shift from about a month ago, right?
Yes.
Where we were seeing more and more institutions making bold public pronouncements that they were coming back to campus and everything was going to be great. Now, my own campus personally has not made that shift. We are still with the, we're going to do this safely, and we're going to create, public compacts about how we're going to be together, and we're going to make everyone, we're going to make everyone as safe as we can. But we're still going to be here in person on campus. It remains to be seen whether we join this shift, but I'm seeing it in institutions of varying sizes, right? It's not just the small liberal arts colleges or just the big urban institutions that are saying, we really can't do this safely. But both now are beginning to make that shift. I just saw Lafayette College this morning having made the announcement that they were going to stay remote for the fall. So that I am paying attention to, in part because it sort of tracks a prediction that was made about a month ago, which is to say that institutions are going to get to the midpoint of the summer and realize it can't be done, and they're going to have to make this change.
Who made that prediction? I wonder.
Who was that?
Some maniac.
Yeah, wild-eyed radical. I don't even remember.
Yeah. Well, that's a great trend to track. That's and thank you for the pointer to Lafayette. Lafayette also just they announced a tuition break. You're 10% off if you're studying from home. Thank you. That's a great metric to track, or a trend, or as you say, a wave, which is very good. Well, let's get a little bit more ambitious. Let's widen the aperture of our lens. Let's think about longer term change beyond the fall. What do you think would be some of the longer term changes, either to your institution, Michigan State University, or to the broader higher education ecosystem as a whole?
Well, I think I'm going to stick with the broader ecosystem because my own institution has gone through enough administrative change over the last couple of years that it's hard to tell exactly what's going to happen. I don't feel like I've got a good read on the administration right now. So, one thing that I know is happening is, we're looking at some serious budget cuts that are going to be coming down the pike shortly. And so I believe that this is not uncommon I think most institutions right now are really facing some budgetary challenges and are thinking very hard about how they're going to survive financially. And so we're going to see, you know, a wave of closures. We're going to see a wave of layoffs. And we're going to see general retrenchment, I think, across higher education institutions. But I also think that it's in certain ways time for institutions of higher education, as well as the apparatus that surrounds those institutions. So I'm thinking about things like scholarly societies and libraries and archives and other aspects of the ways that institutions of higher education do their work. That it's going to be incumbent on all of us finally to reach a kind of mature relationship with the technologies that struggle, that structure, struggle is a very interesting slip, that structure our remote work, right? That it's time for us to be ready to look at what digital pedagogy can do and how it can do it well, rather than simply placing it as a binary up against the face-to-face instruction that all of us really believe in, right? So, and similarly, you know, not just because of COVID and the changes that the pandemic is producing, but also because of other changes, sorry, I've got three ideas trying to come out at once and they're having a hard time fighting their way out. We're going to start seeing changes in scholarly organizations and the ways that they relate to their memberships, the ways that they structure their members' engagement as a field, in large part because those organizations have been so dependent on the annual conference as the moment when everybody comes together, has the conversations that they have, and pushes the field forward, both intellectually and socially. And right now, you know, more and more scholars are facing restrictions around travel that are both physical restrictions due to COVID and budgetary restrictions due to many institutions now canceling all travel funding. And that's making conferences impossible. And so scholarly organizations are similarly, like our educators, being forced to really reckon with what digital pedagogy can be. Scholarly organizations are being forced to reckon with what online engagement for scholarly communities can be. And I think that there's a way in which both of those trends are going to push us to a new kind of maturity in the ways that we as scholars and as instructors and students network online.
Do you think, I mean, perhaps March, April, that sudden shift, that flip online for higher education, just a kind of prelude or opening step to this maturation of our relationship with technology?
I think so. I think it, I mean, I certainly hope we get there. It's the moment for us to take that step. I mean, I don't know about where you are. We flipped that switch with 2 hours notice in March. We got an email at 10 a.m. saying all face-to-face classes are canceled as of noon, move everything online. But we were not given a break, right? This was, we had just come back from spring break. So there was no downtime for us to make the switch. And so there was this panicked move to like, okay, everybody just gets on Zoom and we pretend like we're still having synchronous classes, but we do it through video conferencing and, you know, it'll all be fine. And everybody discovered in the course of that next month and a half why attempting to replicate the face-to-face classroom through these video cameras doesn't work as well as you want it to. You know, students don't want the cameras facing them all the time, so they turn the cameras off. Instructors, they're gesticulating and attempting to interest a bunch of little black boxes with names on them, and it's not working. It's not the kind of engagement we want. So, you know, while the face-to-face is really important and while you want some of these moments of being able to look at a human being and see that there actually is a person on the other end of that network, finding ways to mix in instructional modes that are both synchronous and asynchronous and that ask us to do different kinds of thinking and writing and revising together is far more productive than just attempting to have a seminar through this mode week after week after week. And I think it's that kind of realization that gets the Academy to finally go, oh, there are things that we can do online that actually can produce really solid learning outcomes.
Yes. Well, then there's another spin on this question then, and thank you for that really solid, sober, and inspirational answer. What if we take a look at this transformation and connect it to some of the other giant trends reshaping American society? I'm thinking the big ones such as new nationalism, such as income inequality, or the biggest of all, climate change. I mean, how do you see any intersections happen there?
The intersections are enormous. I mean, there have been calls among scholars for really thinking about the carbon footprint that we're all creating through travel for conferences and travel to give lectures and so forth. And now with all of the travel restrictions that we're facing, both due to the virus and due to budgets being cut, we're able to really take a cold look at some of the travel we've been doing and figure out how necessary it really is, and whether in fact we can find ways to engage with one another, to engage with distant communities in new ways, right? So, you know, I had a talk that I was scheduled to give at another university in April. Needless to say, we canceled that. We, you know, rescheduled it for next April. And they just contacted me yesterday to say, we're still feeling kind of dicey about bringing you in. How would you feel about doing something remote? And we could make it a half-a-day event, and you could have, you know, the public portion and then some seminar-y type things, and we could set up some reading in advance, and we could, you know, and I wrote them back and I said, you know, not only would I be okay with something like that, I'd frankly be relieved, because first of all, I don't want to put myself in a little metal tube any more than I absolutely have to for the next year. But also, like, I want to be part of that reinvention. I really want to think with people about what we can do through these new forms, and to see if we can invent like what the visiting lecture looks like, and what the conference keynote looks like, and what, you know, what we can do synchronously and asynchronously, just like we can with our classes, to create new kinds of intellectual engagement. So yes, climate change. Sorry, you were thinking about other kinds of trends, and
that connects really closely because
exactly. And so it's, you know, we have now the opportunity to really think about how the carbon footprint that we've been creating can in fact be ameliorated and reduced.
Thank you. This is really, really rich and inspirational stuff. Let's take this from another angle. Earlier, you mentioned that the different crises and pressures of 2020 have revealed cracks and fissures in higher education, specifically about social confidence in higher education. Can you say more about that, or is there anything else that the crisis has revealed about American academia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm just trying to figure out where I want to start this particular narrative. You know, I make the argument in Generous Thinking that looking at the history of American higher education from a perspective that you know, sort of claims that American higher education as we understand it today is founded at Johns Hopkins University, right? That it's that melding of the German research institution with the liberal arts focus of instruction coming together that creates the thing that we understand as American higher education. That's one narrative that leads to a highly, highly elite view of what education in the United States is, right? And that if we take a different starting point and instead look at the Morrill Act and the land-grant universities that are created out of it, and the system of state universities being embedded in and serving the people of their states, you get a very different narrative of what higher education is and could be and could become. But even that narrative has gaps and flaws in it that are things that we haven't until now forced ourselves to look at in the ways that the post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests have really demanded. And so, for instance, now we look at that narrative of the Morrill Act and the land-grant universities and are forced to recognize that the land that was granted in that process was land that was taken from indigenous nations, right? So it's not land that just magically appeared. It's land that was taken away in order to found this series of institutions that were primarily aimed at the education still of white men, if not elite white men, right? It only is with time that white women come to be educated by these institutions as well, and only much later even the Black students and students from other minoritized groups. And even now that we are facing a moment, or that we are looking at a moment of much greater diversity in higher education, we're sort of forced to recognize the ways in which all of the structures of these institutions were determined at a moment of some really deep exclusions that still run through the ways our institutions work, what they value, what they reward, and how they hire and promote and ensure a community that is really in communication with the world that surrounds it. And so I think that both the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID are really forcing us to recognize the ways in which, you know, we talk about our university community, but it sort of rings hollow at a moment when, you know, members of our community are being endangered. And we're not stepping forward and really caring for that community. And nor are we really doing the work of outreach to the communities that surround us in order to make sure that the university really is serving the social good for the entirety of the nation. So that, you know, these flaws, they've always been there. This is not anything that's come about recently, but
Right.
they've been highlighted at this particular moment by the kinds of changes that have forced visibility on a lot of us who've been able to ignore it for a long time.
I think of it as a kind of defamiliarization.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very, very good outline of a, not just of an answer, but a way of thinking about higher education. Let's zero in a bit now. Let's narrow the aperture of our lens, and let's look at a couple of different pieces of higher ed. And we wanted to think about teaching and how it's structured. Kristen had a great question. I wonder if you could just go ahead and put that to our guest.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that has been reported from the students is this great sense of loneliness and this great sense of disconnection because of the COVID crisis and everyone being at home and unable to connect and be with one another. So what role does generous thinking play in creating spaces where students do feel connected and they feel like they're being seen online?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I think that one of the things that I hope that generous thinking can do for us at a moment like this is to really recognize that the person on the other end of the video chat or on the other end of the text chat in asynchronous forms, that person has a whole situation surrounding them that we can't necessarily see, right? You can see my space, but this is what you get. And there are ways in which, you know, that's always been true, but we sort of separate from our family lives and from our home situations and go to school, and we have conversations with one another there, and then we go home. Now we're at a moment in which, you know, the family life is right here in the space with you as you were attempting to learn, as you were attempting to teach, as you're attempting to work and have meetings and so forth. And, you know, we're required, I think, as a community to look at the entirety of that circumstance and to really embrace not just the individuals who show up to work in our office building as part of our community, but the entirety of their lives as part of what makes them up and what makes them able to participate in this kind of work. And that's something that we, you know, it's not It's not how we work in American culture, right? We sort of leave family at home, leave the personal at home, come to work, do your job, go home, right? But we're at a point where, you know, you have a conference call with someone and the 5-year-old has to come in and ask a question in the middle of the thing, or we've got to kind of call a break to a meeting so someone can go feed their kid or whatever. I mean, this is all part of who we are, and we're at a moment where we have to show up with all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm hoping is that if we can bring real generosity to thinking about our engagements with the people that we're dealing with, we might gradually come to feel like we're more seen rather than less, because our lives are present rather than just, you know, the brain on a stick. I show up at work and do my job. That's my hope, at least. But that takes a lot of real rethinking on the part of institutions. We saw, was it Florida State several weeks ago that issued the directive that said that if you can't get childcare, you can no longer work from home. Which, like, who's got childcare right now? I mean, you know, this is not a possibility. And that sense that your ability to do the job for 8 hours a day requires your undivided attention, is impossible at this particular moment in time, and B, was always kind of a fiction in the first place. And so really finding ways to insist that our institutions embrace the entirety of the lives of the people who make up those institutions is a really key component, I think, of making it so that all of this feels less lonely, so that you're not having to hide the fact that your 5-year-old is coming in asking a question, or that, you know, the stress that you are experiencing in a moment like this is something you can't share and can't talk about.
So it sounds like an opportunity.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah.
I love this phrase, our lives are present. We're not just a brain on a stick. I love that phrase.
The brain on a stick actually comes from Tedra Osel way back in the early blogging days. She used to write about brain on a stick phenomenon quite a lot.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. And Kristen, thank you for the great question.
Thanks.
Well, let's look at this from a different professional angle, which is, you know, think about the instructional design profession, and that includes, I think, academic computing and parts of the library that are involved in this, as well as educational technology. But, you know, wrap that around as instructional design. What can that profession contribute to higher education in this crisis, or in this moment of crisis?
So much. I think that there is a way that faculty have, up until this moment, been allowed to look at instructional design, by and large, as a nice to have, right? As like, somebody does the bells and whistles for me and teaches me how to use D2L or Moodle or whatever it is we're using. And then I go into the classroom and I do the thing I do, right? But all of a sudden it becomes clear that all of that design is not just bells and whistles, right? In fact, it's really thinking carefully about how to organize content, how to create engagement through an interface that could be a blocker rather than a connector. And really, you know, rethinking what it is we're trying to do in a class and how do you do it in new forms. And so I think that instructional design, all of a sudden, a whole lot of faculty, not everybody, but a whole lot of faculty are looking up and recognizing this is crucial and I need to learn more. And so we have a great opportunity for instructional designers and technologists to really help re-educate the faculty about what it is that they're trying to accomplish and how to reach their goals. We have the possibility of really, really creating collaborative relationships instead of service relationships. And that I think would be an ideal for all of us.
And shifting away from a service relationship to a collaborative one is also, I would nominate that as part of generous thinking as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. And this question is partly aimed at Kristen's colleagues, because many students in the LDT program will work in or around instructional design.
Absolutely.
We have I want to shift our focus to another part of higher education, which is the production of science, both the natural sciences and I think as well the social sciences. And let me set that up. We've seen in 2020 an interesting struggle over the relevance of science in popular culture. That is, we've seen the embrace of science, especially epidemiology and public health by some, as well as skepticism of science. Everything from rising anti-vax sentiment to the popularity of Gwyneth Paltrow, and of course, Republican attacks on public health. So what does all this tell us about how academia crafts scientific research messages and how we persuade the public that that this matters and it's true? I mean, you earlier said that we've lost the ability to tell our story well to the public.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that from that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is something that the sciences have recognized for a number of years now and have really been attempting to work on. I mean, there's an entire field that has grown up, like instructional design, around that need to create an interface between scientists and the public. So you've got science communicators who are working at many large research institutions, who are looking at the work that scientists are doing on campus and who are really attempting to figure out how you tell that story to the public in a way that helps bring public interest to the sciences and to the work that the institution is doing in particular. And that, I mean, that project of science communication is really focused on not dumbing the work down, but on communicating it and translating it in a way that makes its importance and its relevance and its focus clear for a public that isn't necessarily trained in scientific argot, and that really kind of needs to be brought into, why is this important? Why should I care about this? That's been successful up to a point. But we're at a moment now where there is so much information, good and bad, circulating out there on the internet, that the bad information moves just as quickly, if not more quickly, than the good information does. And it's becoming harder and harder, I think, for people who don't necessarily have scientific training or social scientific training or insight into the kinds of things that enable you to figure out whether a story coming to you is something that should be accepted or something that should be questioned. It becomes harder and harder to figure out what good information is and where there are problems. And that's not helped by the fact that a number of the sciences have recently been going through verification crises, right? Where it turns out that a whole lot of those foundational psychological experiments that tell you things about human behavior, in fact, can't be replicated. And that or we're relying on bad data, or, so the number of retractions that are happening in the scientific community right now is further undermining the ability of the public to just say, we trust our scientists. Yeah. So couple that with a political agenda that is happy to undermine public faith in science, that is happy to say climate change isn't real, evolution isn't real, that all of these things are ideological projects of the left designed to mislead you and to corrupt your children's minds. And you wind up with an even deepened divide between a certain percentage of the voting public and the projects of science and social science and higher education. So because of this, it becomes even more necessary for all of us. And I mean, not just the science communicators who sit between scientists and the public, but all scientists and all social scientists, all academics, to become communicators in their own right and to help the communities with which they're engaged think through what is good knowledge today. How do you know what to trust? How do you find good information? And so, you know, there's some really great projects, and I'm thinking in particular right now of the Social Science Research Center and the Social Science Research Council, and some of the work that they're doing on thinking about information and misinformation in the political sphere right now. We need more projects like that that are attempting to surface where these problematic claims are coming from, about vaccines, for instance, and about climate change and more, and are really doubling down on getting good information out there. The climate scientists have discovered that they have to be like primed when an article comes out that is talking about climate change. They have to be there and ready to comment on it and to promote it and to argue for it, because the hordes of bots and trolls and so forth that are trying to undermine that work are all there and ready. And we cannot simply just publish the article and step back from it and assume that its truth will come out, right? We have to be there to ensure that the uptake of the article is as robust as it should be. So I guess what I'm trying to get at again is this sense in which all scholars, all researchers, everybody who's producing knowledge today has to be able to communicate that knowledge in ways that the public not only can understand the knowledge, but can understand like why. Why is this important? How do I fit this into my worldview? How do I understand this in the scheme of the world that I live in?
Think about some of the climate change and communication projects at George Mason or at Yale.
Yeah.
I see. Well, that's a huge call. That's a huge ask for a lot of scientists.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And there's a lot of resistance to it. I think there are a lot of researchers and a lot of scholars who think, like I am producing knowledge for my field and for other experts. And I just want to publish that monograph or that article and let the expert, like other people can make of it what they want to make of it. But increasingly we discover that's a terrible mistake, right? That unless we're there actively arguing on behalf of the knowledge that we create, it just appears to the public to be useless.
Are there any particular differences for the social sciences in this as opposed to the natural sciences? So I'm thinking about psych, I'm thinking about economics.
Yeah. I don't know if there are, what would I say? I think there are a number of economists who have had a line on public discourse and a line to public discourse that have frankly done a lot of damage in, you look back on 2008 and the moment of that particular crash and the number of academic economists who were saying that, this was never going to happen, right? That the kinds of investments that were being produced could never crash. And we're all going to be fine. The real estate market was secure forever. And, but that did not come to pass.
Have you seen the documentary Inside Job?
Yes.
Oh, it's so good. It's funny in a dark way.
Absolutely. So, I think there are ways in which social scientists can show up on television, or they can show up in the newspaper, they can show up in op-eds, they can have blogs, they can do a lot of things that sound convincing, but may not necessarily be based on the soundest work. There are a lot of other really critical voices in social science research that it would do us good to hear more from. And so I think a lot, I'm not sure if it's different from science per se, but I do think that there are some extremely strong voices that are starting to emerge in sociology, for instance. I'm thinking about Tressie McMillan Cottom, who is, her work is based on rigorous sociological research and yet she is able to speak with a public audience about the things that they know and experience and care about in ways that really are profoundly important. And I think that a lot more social scientists, a lot more humanists could bear to learn from that kind of model.
That's a great example. She's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we have, I'm conscious of time, and especially of your time, both of you. And I want to make sure that we treat this quite seriously and we don't go over. We have one final question, which shifts our analytical lens to a different angle, a technical angle. What do you think of the role of the digital divide in higher education?
It's really astonishing the degree to which I think a lot of us have assumed that the digital divide is no longer the kind of factor that it was, because everybody's got a smartphone. So, you know, you can access whatever information you need without recognizing, I mean, Bryan, you know this firsthand, the problems with internet access in remote rural areas, right? That really becomes a problem for many of our students in higher education. We, you know, saw stories during the period after the March, April kind of move to virtual instruction of my own institution, for instance, ensuring that students could take their cars and go park in the parking garages and use their laptops to access the Wi-Fi there, because many of them didn't have robust enough Wi-Fi at home or even any internet access. And so I think that, you know, if we're going to be at a moment in which, and I really do think, again, remote instruction of the kinds that we're exploring right now has the potential to make more education more available to more people, only if they can access it, right? And they need robust internet access, and they need technological capabilities. And so my hope is that we are at a moment in which we might be willing to press harder, if the election goes the way that it ought to, on issues of whether the internet ought to be a regulated utility, and whether we ought to understand it as being so fundamental to contemporary life and contemporary success that everyone must have access to it. So I think you know, we have the potential to get ourselves beyond some of the problems that the digital divide poses, but only if we've got the will to really push that kind of work forward.
Yes. Last week, 2 weeks ago, the Biden campaign announced they would invest $20 billion in rural broadband infrastructure. I mean, that's a campaign thing. I don't know, but it's better than what we have now. Truly. Kristen, you experienced this yourself, I think, in Fairfax Public Schools.
Yeah, so as a teacher at Fairfax County Public Schools, we have about 60,000, we serve 189,000 students, and approximately 60,000 of those students qualify for free and reduced lunches. It is a gauge for us to figure out that those students also probably do not have access to internet devices, or if they do have access to internet devices, they are typically cell phones, not enough to do any of their homework or schoolwork on.
Right.
So yeah, we had in the spring upwards of 60,000 students who perhaps did not get the education that they deserved because of the digital divide. And that's my personal, that's my pet rock. I want to see how I can help with that.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
Oh, well, this is, thank you. And Kristen, yes, high five. This is what we want to do. We have a final spot left for an extra question or an extra topic. And this would be based on our conversation so far.
Yeah.
And if there's an idea or topic that we want to press on further, or if there's one that we missed and now occurs to you that we should address.
So I'm just looking at some notes that I made yesterday to sort of jog my memory about things that I didn't get around to. One of the things that I had sort of intended to say,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to figure out how to come around this, is in thinking about, you know, what's happening out there in the world right now among institutions of higher education as they're making these decisions about whether to bring students back on campus, about whether to do the work that they do entirely or mostly online, about who must report to work physically and who is able to work remotely, about budget cuts and the future of people's jobs and so forth. That we're hearing, I think, the thinness of the rhetoric into which a lot of institutional focus on mission and values has gone, right? That, you know, we hear a lot in mission statements about creating community, about shared vision, about service, about, you know, about learning and engagement, and a lot of things that under pressure begin to crumble. And so right now, you know, one of the phrases that I've been personally hearing a lot, I've been hearing this at my own institution, but I'm hearing this from a lot of other institutions as well, is the notion of the shared sacrifice, right? That we're at a difficult moment in higher education, and, you know, getting through this moment and making sure that our institutions are going to survive is going to require all of us to participate in a shared sacrifice. And there's something that I find so unnerving about that phrase, not least that, you know, all of us that work in hierarchical organizations know perfectly well that sacrifice rolls downhill. And it does not, you know, however much folks at the top may say, we are participating in this sacrifice as well, we are cutting our own salaries, we are, you know, doing away with things, you know, the end result of this is going to be yet another associate vice president position that's in charge of shared sacrifice. And it's a real problem. So I mean, what I'm trying to think about right now a lot, and it's a question that I got when I was traveling around, you know, prior to the ending of travel as we knew it, talking about generous thinking. I was at a land-grant institution in the East, talking about the book and about these ideas for thinking about what an institution that actually lived up to its mission and its values might look like, and how we could shape one of those. You know, and this is early 2019, so, you know, things are looking pretty flush at that particular moment, if politically a little dicey. And this one faculty member asked me, you know, this is all well and good at a moment like this, when the university has resources and we're, you know, investing in new programs and we're thinking about new possibilities. But what does generosity look like in hard times? How do we remain generous when basically you've circled all of the department chairs in your college and said one of your departments is going away? How do we maintain a sense of generosity and community at a moment when all of a sudden administrative staff positions seem disposable, while, you know, faculty positions become more tenuous, but not in the same kind of way? You know, when those hierarchies and fractures on campus become visible, how do you maintain a feeling of community and generosity? And I mean, frankly, I think, you know, that is at least at my own institution, the $350 million question, is how you figure out how to make something that we call a shared sacrifice, not just rhetorical and not empty. But instead figuring out how to genuinely support the people that make up the institution and the lives that they live with us. And it is not easy. I do not have an answer for this, but I do know that if we're not capable of doing that, perhaps our institutions shouldn't survive.
for me, that echoes Tracy William Cottom's line that it's better for an institution to die than for one single member of its community.
Absolutely.
What does the state funding picture look like for Michigan State right now?
That is an extremely open question. We have, as you know, Gretchen Whitmer, our Democratic governor, and a Republican-led legislature, who were last year in a budget battle about, you know, basically it came down to you can have roads or you can have education, which do you want? And so MSU did not get its budget from the state until very late into the budget year. We have no idea what it's going to look like next year. We have no idea. And, you know, the new budget year has begun. We're a month into it. We'll find out at some point whether the state's going to live up to its obligations or not. And that's a mess. That is not how higher education should be run.
That's one where you have to really dip into all kinds of reserves, financial, ethical.
Yes, or that shared sacrifice begins to cut pretty deeply.
Well, I've got to ask the associate VP for shared sacrifice.
Right.
I'm just waiting to see that. We're just about the end of the hour, and you have been so generous with your thinking and with your planning, your reflections, and you've given us so much based on your really unusual career and your striking observations. Thank you so much.
Bryan, thank you. Thank you for asking me to do this with you. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, it's our pleasure. And Kristen, thank you for your question and your thoughts.
Absolutely. It was great. It was great getting to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you.